Hello everybody and welcome to another board game review and gameplay demo. Today I'm going to be talking all about Forsaken Forest, a social deduction and hidden team game for up to 12 people. Before I get started though, if you haven't done so already, please take a look at all my various social media pages as well as my Patreon page. On all of those you can interact with myself and my channel in a whole bunch of really cool ways. So jumping right into the game, this is one that's got its start on Kickstarter and actually only recently hit retail. The company was nice enough to send me this copy so that I could take a look at it and tell you guys what I think of it. So the idea behind this game is that you and your cohorts, your other players, are trying to get out of a forest. This forest is haunted by the Forsaken, who are actively working against you. Essentially, several of your team members are going to be playing on the Forsaken team, where everybody else are villagers trying to get back home. That's the entire point. And it combines a lot of aspects of social deduction, as well as playing your roles or not playing your roles, bluffing, all of that kind of stuff, which I really enjoy. And on top of that, you've got a board and cards that you can play to activate certain things that you can do throughout both your turn as well as other players' turns. It's a pretty interesting combination and I'm really excited to get started with it. So we're going to jump right into what this game is similar to. As far as similarities are concerned, there are a lot of options for Forsaken Forest, where we've got games related to social deduction, team-based planning, and all sorts of other things. So what I wanted to do is split it into two major categories and have a major example of each one. The first one is hidden teams. The major example of this one that I like is A Study in Emerald. In that game, you have people who are either for or against the rise of the Elder Ones in the Cthulhu mythos. And in this case, we have a very similar thematic sense where we've got sort of that horror genre thing going, and at the same time you know that the bad guys are out there, you know that other players are bad guys, but you don't know exactly who, and the entire point of the game is going through the process of playing the cards and going through the different missions and all this kind of thing to try to gain as much information as you possibly can as quickly as you can. The other major one is obviously social deduction games, and for this particular one I wanted to look at One Night Ultimate Werewolf. Essentially in this case you have the similar sort of day-night cycle. You have a literal day-night cycle, and the idea is that during each night you've got the narration where the certain roles have their specific abilities that they can do, and the bad guys end up doing a ritualistic killing and all sorts of other stuff like that. The thing is that Forsaken Forest is bigger in scope in terms of you go through multiple day-night cycles, but it has that very similar feel around the table as far as interacting with your fellow players. But with that, we're going to dive right into how to play Forsaken Forest. Alright everybody, we're just about all set up and ready to start playing Forsaken Forest. In this game we're playing as a group who is trying to escape the forest. We start in the middle and we're trying to go to these various destinations to find our village. In the meantime, there are Forsaken who are players that are actively working against the rest of the group and trying to kill them or draw them into the void. In order to get the game started, we will be distributing roles based off of the number of players that we have, where in this particular case, if I was playing with 4 people, I would have 4 common folk, which are the villagers, and then I would have 1 Forsaken who will be actively working against everybody. So those are randomly distributed. Everybody also gets 3 Traveler deck cards. So the Traveler decks, these are going to be the various actions that you'll be taking throughout the game during the day-night cycles that the game runs through, but we'll finish up setup really quickly first. Essentially, the game starts with Night 1. During Night 1, any and all Forsaken will open their eyes and say, okay, here's what we're doing, and they distribute the destinations. The destination cards are mostly dead ends, but these are how we are trying to get out of the forest. There is one successful one for the villagers, which is the village, and there is also one successful one for the Forsaken, which is the void. The Forsaken will distribute these cards however they wish, and so they will all know the location of each destination at the beginning of the game. Let's take a look at how they each win. The villagers villagers win if they successfully navigate to the village and enter into the red box right next to wherever its card is. The Forsaken will win if they successfully navigate the group to the void. Again, same thing, going into the box. The Forsaken will also win if the ratio of Forsaken to villagers is ever 1-to-1 or better. In other words, in this particular case, I start off with 3 common folk and only 1 Forsaken. If it ever gets to 1 Forsaken and 1 common folk, that means that the Forsaken win. The villagers also win if all of the Forsaken have been killed. There are several cards in the Traveler deck, as well as some others, that will enable players to kill one another, essentially. Now that we have everything set up after the initial night action, let's talk about the overall phases of the game and how they progress. First is day 1. The idea of all the day actions is that we are going through a progression of 6 player actions every time. On a player turn, you will draw a card from the Traveler deck, you'll play an action card on one of the designated slots here, whichever one you're on, and then after the 6th one, we will draw a card from the Forest deck. The Forest deck is basically all the bad stuff where we'll be attacked and depleted and all sorts of other nasty stuff, rotating cards and doing all sorts of weird nastiness. So night 2 occurs if the Forest card is something like this, where we have Encroaching Darkness. So at the end of this cycle, we will go into night. During night 2, that's when the Forsaken come back out. The Forsaken will take their night action card of Ritual Sacrifice and place it on top of the pile of cards for one of the other players, one of the villagers. That means that that villager is now on death's doorstep. There are also other special cards that have their own night actions that I'll talk about in just a little bit. So talking about death's doorstep, the idea is that there are 2 major ways for it to happen: Ritual Sacrifice or by some kind of an item card, some kind of a weapon, if you get shot, whatever it is. If you're on death's doorstep, then that means that now you are in trouble and hopefully somebody can save you. There are special cards that are essentially interrupts that will allow you to be saved from being on death's doorstep, and they're not very frequent. There's relatively few of them, and they are fairly far between, but they do exist, and they will save a character from being on death's doorstep. If you aren't saved, you become a ghost, right? After the second night, then that's when the next day you wake up, see if somebody's dead, and then you essentially continue that day-night cycle where you go through and you do the 6, draw the card. If it's not night, you keep playing through the 6 until night occurs. After night occurs, Ritual Sacrifices play again, etc., etc. And you keep going until any of the win conditions has been fulfilled. Now, as far as the actions are concerned, you have 2 major types based off of your traveling cards here. You've got fast and slow actions. Slow actions in general are the ones that you're going to be playing here because those are only viable on your turn. Fast actions you can play at literally any time, whether it's during your turn, during somebody else's turn, or as an interrupt, depending on what they are. Most of the cards are very self-explanatory as far as what they do and how they can be done. Most of the time you're going to be doing navigation. Navigation is seen by cards like this that have this sort of little compass symbol in the top corner. And essentially the way this works is, let's say I'm first player, I would say I'm going on a carriage ride. So I place it on the number 1 here. I'm first player, so I place it on number 1. I forge a path, and then I get to take another action. So I will forge a path, I put little footprints there. I take another action, forge up to 2 paths. All of them must connect that I make in this manner. The way forging a path works is very simple. You either build off of footprints that already exist in any direction, or you build off from the center. This is a lot of the crux of the negotiation for this game, where sometimes somebody might be saying, I've already seen this destination card, I know it's bad, we can't go that way. Guys, follow me this way. Something along those lines. There's a lot of different powers that allow you to do a lot of different things. And that includes looking at other players' actual items, or their roles, or any other number of things. So let's talk a little bit about death and how we get to it. There are a few cards in here that are called the Gallows. The gallows are shown by a little hangman's noose. And the idea behind that is that's sort of the accusation card of this game. So this is an example: cast suspicion. Choose a player and send them to the gallows. And then you also have the Ritual Sacrifice, or specific items that say that player is now on death's door. Again, this is how you potentially die. Being on the gallows, you have to essentially say, I'm innocent and here's why. Present your evidence. You can potentially call witnesses, have them ask you questions, and then everybody either votes thumbs up or thumbs down. And whichever one wins, you either live or you're on death's doorstep. And so this is essentially how the villagers can eliminate the Forsaken from the game. That's one way, and also by the items that say somebody is now on death's doorstep. But that's essentially all it is. And then, so let's talk a little bit about some of these special, the special actions and the special characters that this game has. Both sides have special characters that they can use, where the villagers have more of them, the common folk have more, where you have the blessed, for example. So in this case, if you're on death's doorstep as the blessed, you can say, nope, I'm blessed, and you're automatically healed. You've got the navigator, who is allowed to secretly look at one of the destination cards during the night, which is very helpful in seeing who is leading us where, especially if you find the void. And then you have the oracle, who is allowed to look at somebody's hand, which is pretty or look at somebody's roll card, which is pretty awesome. The priest is allowed to play one of the other night actions, in his case, shelter from evil. Essentially, the priest will play this card, and if both Shelter from Evil and the Ritual Sacrifice are on the same player, that player is not harmed. Next up for the Forsaken, we have a couple of different things here. We have the Coward, who is always fun. So the Coward is unique because they win if the Forsaken win, but they are not technically a Forsaken. They also know who the Forsaken are, but Forsaken do not know who the Coward is. The other major ones for the Forsaken, we have the Silencer. So the way that the Silencer works is they can actually stop somebody from speaking. They play the other night action here, which is Entangle. And that means that you can't speak or take any actions this turn cycle. Pretty nasty. Last but not least, for the special abilities, there are two that are essentially spies. So we have ones that say the Forsaken and the Commoners. The problem is that these are actually not. So the Shrouded appears to anybody looking that they are a regular villager, but they are actually a Forsaken. Just like this one, the Forsaken is actually the Cursed. This is a villager who appears to be a Forsaken, but really isn't. So these can throw a lot of wrenches into it. The problem is, since they're double-sided, as opposed to the other other roll cards here, which have the pink backing on them, you have to play these with the sleeves on them in order to make them work. But as you might guess, this is a game where once you really get into the flow of things, it goes a lot faster and play occurs really, really quickly and very rapidly. But regardless, we're going to jump right into the pros and cons and general conclusions now. Jumping right into pros and cons, there are a few for each that I really wanted to mention. First and foremost, my major pro is the integration of all of these different mechanics. We've got hidden roles, we've got movement across a board, we've got card plays, we've got the narration with the day-night cycle. We've got a lot of different aspects going on here. And the game does a reasonable job of balancing everything out and keeping things streamlined, which is relatively unique in games like this because they can tend to become really bogged down. On top of that, it doesn't feel like when it's not my turn, I don't feel like I'm completely out of the action because there's constantly a conversation going on, which is why I love social deduction games like this in particular. Next up on the pros for me is the integration of the theme. This is not something that I normally talk about, and especially with a game like this. I'm not a huge fan of horror, and art is never really something that catches my eye, but the fact is I really like the art style of this game, and I think it feeds the theme absolutely perfectly. It has that really nice sort of grim, terrible, all is lost type of feeling to it, and I fully believe that that is exactly what we would feel as people lost in this enchanted forest that is actively trying to kill us. I think that it does a really good job of maintaining that all throughout, as well as having the sort of disparate conversations that you would have within the group throughout the entirety of trying to get out type of thing. Last but not least on the pros, the major one that I wanted to mention finally is the replayability. Between having the different types of roles that have specific actions that they can take, and then also having the secret roles that appear to be one thing but are actually the other team, I think that it's really nice to have that sort of second level of capability going on. Not to mention the fact that you can play with anywhere between 4 and 12 people, and I haven't played with huge numbers of people, but at least with the relatively lower numbers, it seems well balanced and reasonably paced. And And again, assuming that everything holds, then you can still be able to talk at the higher numbers and all that kind of stuff. But regardless, having all of those different, all of the different roles, all the different travelers cards, things can be redone, replayed, and it feels different every time, just like many social deduction games. That said, going right into the cons, the first and major one that I really wanted to mention is the rules. There is nothing inherently wrong with the rules. They are not badly written, but they are poorly organized and badly designed. The problem is that there are a few key things that are completely missing from the rules, or at least I didn't personally see them. For example, the night cards, the night actions have the same backing that the regular travelers ones do, but nowhere in the rules does it explicitly state set the night action cards aside or something along those lines. You do have a separate thing that says the night deck, but it doesn't say that there's supposed to be a separate night deck. So you just have to make some sort of leaps of logic in that sense to figure out some of that kind of stuff. And it can be really frustrating, especially for either inexperienced gamers or people who just don't want to sit around for an hour literally just trying to dissect the rules and see what's this piece, what's that piece, what's the other piece, right? Next up on my cons is relatively similar to that, and that is the components. So the thing is that all of the components are very, very similar. The card backs are identical except for the color. And the problem with that is just, again, it becomes difficult as especially new players to really figure out, okay, what is it I'm drawing? What do I need to draw from? It's much easier to just have some sort of text that tells you this is this type of card, this is this type of card, so that it just maintains a little bit of ease. That said, they're different enough in terms of how many there are that it's not too bad, but it still can be relatively frustrating. Next up on the cons, again, along the same lines of the components, is the sheer number of those travelers cards. And this is something that a lot of games do, where you have a whole lot of cards available, and the problem ends up being you either get banks of cards that weren't shuffled very well because there's a bunch of duplicates of them, like in this case the Wander, the travel cards, or you'll get a whole bunch of cards that really don't interact well together and don't synergize together, so your entire group kind of ends up in big trouble because you can't do much to stop what's going on. Last but certainly not least on the cons is probably my second least favorite aspect of it, and that is what happens when you die. Now, the fact is, in a game like this, a horror game where you're lost in the woods and everything is actively trying to kill you, people are going to die. It's one of the main mechanics of the game. The problem is, I do not like how they handle player death. Granted, the designers and the company, whoever came up with it, they try to do something with it. But as I've mentioned in videos before, player elimination is one of the mechanics that I despise the most in board gaming. It's something that's really easy to screw up, and the thing is, this game does a better job than others at dealing with it because eliminated players are still in the game, but they're really not. Your turn doesn't count, you don't get any cards, you don't get any actions, you don't get to do anything except just sit there and talk. Is it better than something like Risk? Yes. But something like One Night Ultimate Werewolf, where you completely reset the game every time, or a game like Welcome to the Dungeon, where the rounds are so short that it makes no difference, then in something like that, it makes a lot more sense. In a game like this that can drag on for an hour and a half, potentially 2 hours, not super easily, but potentially, it can be really, really difficult to truly get anywhere and to really have an effect when you are a ghost, especially if you have a group that doesn't work well and doesn't jive well together. But that said, overall, talking about my conclusions, I really did like this game. I wasn't expecting to because of the theme primarily, but when I saw that it was social deduction with a little bit more strategy, some of the card playing, that kind of stuff, I was intrigued and I was like, okay, yeah, we'll give it a try. And I really did enjoy it. I thought that it was well made. I thought it was reasonably well balanced after I managed to get through the rules and everything. But the thing is, it really made me reminisce about things like Battlestar Galactica, Dead of Winter, Shadows over Camelot, Study in Emerald, all of those kinds of really more meaty social deduction games where you have somebody who's not only actively working against you, but they're able to really hide in plain sight a lot better than something like The Resistance. And so it's definitely worth it if you enjoy those types of games and a lot of table talk and are willing to read through through the rules for a while, but otherwise it might not necessarily be for you, but it is worth a try, assuming that you can get a relatively smaller group, because that'll tend to be a little bit shorter. But regardless, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.